Remember how bluntly but accurately the Apostle Paul put it? If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. The physical resurrection of Jesus Christ is the heart of the Christian faith. Why is the resurrection so important? Well, number one, it authenticates Jesus' claim to be God. Secondly, it gives the strongest evidence possible for the existence of God. And thirdly, it gives us hope. Not only does Jesus' resurrection mean everything he said is true, but it proves there really is life beyond this one. But the big question is it true? Was Jesus really raised from the dead? If there is one undeniable fact, it's this: Jesus' tomb was empty. The Jewish leaders turned Jerusalem upside down, trying to find Jesus' body. All they had to do was produce the corpse of Jesus, and Christianity would collapse like a house of cards. But the tomb was empty, and this was verified by the Roman government, by Jesus' disciples, and by secular historians writing at that time. How do we account for the empty tomb? Well, several theories have been suggested through the ages. Let's just take three of the most prominent. 1, the body was stolen. 2, the disciples hallucinated. And 3, Jesus swooned on the cross. The first one, Jesus' body was stolen. Now, in Jesus' day, Jews were governed by Rome. Now, remember, both the Roman and the Jewish authorities were determined that Jesus' body would stay in that grave. They didn't want any more trouble. The Jewish leaders had told the Roman officials that Jesus said he would rise again on the third day. So just to be certain, they placed an elite guard around Jesus' tomb. An enormous stone that was covering the entrance of the tomb was made secure, and nothing was left to chance. So why on earth would either the Roman government or the Jewish leaders steal Jesus' body? The only conceivable reason would be if his followers claimed Jesus had risen, then they could produce Jesus' body and Christianity would be closed. But when the disciples began saying this very thing, Christ is risen, the authorities had no body to produce because they clearly hadn't taken it. Instead, we're told, the Jewish leaders bribed the guards to say that while they were sleeping, the disciples came and removed the body of Jesus. Now, who is going to believe such a story? Everyone knew that these elite soldiers were accustomed to all-night sentry duty. They also knew there would be terrible punishment if the guards failed in any way. It is inconceivable that they would have fallen asleep. And don't you think it's rather remarkable that the guards were able to identify who stole the body while they were sleeping? The story simply falls apart. But could Jesus' followers have stolen the body? Well, the disciples were so traumatized after Jesus' death that they were hiding out. They were terrified that what had happened to Jesus would also be their fate. And why would fearful, disillusioned men want to risk death by stealing the body just to spread a lie? And except for John, every disciple ultimately faced torture and death. Why would they do this if they knew it was a hoax? And once the persecution came, surely someone would have cracked under the pressure and told the truth. It never happened. Why? Because they had seen the risen Lord. Now, second theory is the hallucination theory. This theory is that the disciples wanted to see Jesus so much, they simply hallucinated and they thought they were seeing Jesus raised. Now, this is a very clever argument because it asserts that the disciples weren't lying. They were just deceived. They loved Jesus so much and they longed to see him so fervently that they simply had a collective hallucinatory experience over and over again for 40 days. Yet modern psychological theory tells us several things about hallucination. Hallucinations are highly individualistic. It is the experience of an individual, not to groups at a time. Yet Jesus appeared multiple times to different groups of people. Paul even writes that the risen Jesus appeared to more than 500 of his followers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Now, do you get what Paul's doing? He's saying, hey, check it out. If you don't believe me, there are people who will vouch for what it is we are saying. Remember, Paul's letters were circulated and they were public knowledge. Now, if you were a skeptic wanting to disprove Christianity, hearing that Paul mentions witnesses by name, wouldn't you go and find these people in order to find someone who would contradict Paul's report? Yet not one piece of contradictory literature from that period ever emerged. Wouldn't you think at least one letter of protest would have survived, considering all the New Testament literature that we have? Thirdly, there is the theory that Jesus swooned on the cross and then later resuscitated. The theory goes like this. Jesus didn't die on the cross. He became unconscious. So the guards, thinking he was dead, placed Jesus in the tomb. And then Jesus eventually regained consciousness and walked nearly 40 miles, proclaiming that he had been raised from the dead. Now, let's take a look at this argument. Jesus was severely beaten. He was nailed to a cross. He had lost a tremendous amount of blood and was declared dead by professional executioners who put a spear through his side just to be certain. And then in a damp burial grave, Jesus survived 3 days with no food, no water, no medical attention, revived, got out of his grave clothes, and then pushed an enormous boulder out of the way and somehow got past his armed guards. Then he walked 40 miles on feet that had nails driven through them just 3 days before and essentially says, I am the Lord, risen from the dead. I don't think so. How could a man barely able to walk convince people that he had just conquered death once and for all? Now, the good news of the gospel is that a real death was followed by a real resurrection. People had real encounters with the risen Jesus. This wasn't a fantasy, nor an hallucination. If we deny the resurrection took place, then we need to give a plausible answer as to what happened that day, and then decide, is my answer an even greater leap of faith than believing God's Son rose from the dead? The greatest news in the entire universe is that Jesus is alive today. The New Testament boldly declares, since Christ was raised from the dead, he cannot die again. Death no longer has mastery over him. The good news of the gospel is that Jesus is alive and you can know him today.